As you may or may not know, I've been retranslating the Chinese classic Hong Lo Meng, or Dream of the Red Chamber. My project is a translation in process. I'm currently up to chapter 14 of 120, so we've got a way to go. And you can come check out the translation for yourself, check out redchamber.blog, or click on the link in the description. Anyway, I've been doing this crazy project for a little bit over a year now, and I've probably got something like, 9 years to go. But hey, there's no rush at all. Anyway, I've learned a lot as I've been translating. One of the things I've learned is that the famous David Hawkes translation, The Story of the Stone, is actually quite flawed. But it's not just the Hawkes translation that has problems, and it's also not because Hawkes was trying to hide something or distort the novel. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Hawkes realized that there were a lot of cultural concepts in this book that didn't translate neatly to English. And so David Hawkes decided to stay away from using footnotes and just changed a few things here and there to help the novel make more sense. This is why I include these translation critique sections in my Substack-based translation project. It's because I can help explain what Hawkes meant when he called a certain type of wood deal, for example. So this project is kind of a translation and it's kind of a critique. It's also kind of a glossary, it's kind of a historical document with a scanned text from the original clean copy of the 1792 novel. And it's also kind of a blog. It's like all this stuff at once. Anyways, you can imagine there are a lot of challenges with this book that make it difficult to translate. Because of the unusual way that this book was composed, translating it into English in a way that makes sense really is not easy. And so I have decided to share some of my frustrations and challenges with you. Anyway, so here's a list of 5 challenges that I've come across in my first year of translation. Now, if you've read Dream of the Red Chamber before, you probably have at least an idea of some of these, though you might be surprised by some of the other ones and how deep they go. If you've read the book in Chinese before, however, you'll know exactly what it is that I'm talking about. Anyway, here we go. First of all, the names of the characters are really hard to deal with. Now, there are 2 layers to this complexity. The first one is probably going to be obvious to you. If you don't read or speak Chinese, it's going to be difficult for you just to tell these characters apart from each other. And this is where I can stick in that requisite lecture about naming conventions being different. So in Chinese, the family name is given first, followed by the given name. So usually there are 2 given names. For example, Jia Bao Yu, who is the male protagonist. But sometimes there's only 1 given name. For example, Jia Jian, who's an older guy who assaults his daughter-in-law. Anyway, when you start reading this book, the names will be a little bit hard to manage if you're not used to Chinese names. But that's not really what I'm talking about here. The problem that every translator faces in this book is the fact that most of the character names have hidden meanings. This is actually really clear if you read the first page of the first chapter in Chinese, but you will probably miss it in the major English translations. There are 2 plays on words here in the first section. It says here that the name Zhenshi, one of the first characters we meet, comes because the author decided to jiang Zhenshi Chu, or to take the truth and hide it away. Now, it is certainly possible to translate this part, though it loses a lot of its effect in English. In my opinion, the best thing I can do as a translator is explain this in translation notes like this one. And this is one of the reasons why it's so useful and powerful to do this as an online translation, is because I don't have to worry about how many pages I'm using up or like how thick the book is or anything like that. Doing this in blog format enables me to explain this stuff clearly, even if it's complex and even if it takes up a lot of time. And it also makes it so you can speak with me directly. Anyway, the second play on words is down near the bottom. The name Jia Yu Cun is explained by an idiomatic phrase, Jia Yu Cun Yan, which means something like false words and common language. It's part of how the author explains why he's using common and colloquial language to write his novel as opposed to more formal and classical language. Of course, the overall effect is to make it so that the reader realizes early on that there's a lot of hidden meaning throughout this book. And part of the fun of this novel is trying to figure all of this stuff out. I'll give you one more example of this, and it's one that the author doesn't explain in Chinese. In fact, I think there are a lot of people who don't know about this. My guess is that if you're watching this, you almost certainly don't know about this, especially if you've only read the translations in English. First of all, let's talk a little bit about Lin Daiyu's name. Lin Daiyu is the most memorable character in this entire book and is probably one of the most memorable characters in all of world literature. If you think of the characters as superheroes, Lin Daiyu's superpower would be crying. Now, there's an obvious reason for that. This is part of the mythology that the book explains in the first chapter. I'm not going to go too deep into that today, though. I don't want this to be like an hour-long video. However, there's another reason why the name Lin Daiyu is associated with crying. It's directly implied in her name, and again, I think that most native speakers of Chinese will probably miss this part. Lin Daiyu's given name is actually a direct reference to one of the most famous Tang Dynasty poems, a classic poem that educated native speakers study to this day. This would be the Changhen Ge, or Song of Everlasting Regret, by Bai Juyi. This is a poem that is long and filled with all sorts of literary references. This particular passage describes the beauty of the famous woman Yang Guifei like a pear blossom bathed in springtime rain. Now in Chinese, the final two characters here are Daiyu, which is a homophone with Lin Daiyu's given name. And there's a modern Chinese idiom that comes from this, Li Hua Daiyu, which means a weeping beauty, like a beautiful woman who cries all the time, which is of course a very apt description of Lin Daiyu herself. So that's the thing about this book. If you think about it for a second, you would not only have to recognize the original poem and know that idiom, but you'd still have to take a few minutes to think about it to get that literary connection. It's a really little thing, sure, but it's really cool when you discover it, and that also makes it really hard to translate. Anyway, like I said, the advantage that I have is that I can write these blog posts that go into a lot of detail about these subjects, and then I have to hope that somebody, actually reads them. The connection between Lin Daiyu and Yang Guifei is not accidental, but if I say more about that, I'm going to wind up spoiling too much of the story for you. So what's in a name, right? Anyway, there's a lot more stuff like this in this book, and I honestly have to remind myself to slow down in the translation and to look for these little things, especially once the story really gets going. Now, tricky names are not the only thing that makes this book difficult to translate into English. The other problem, of course, is the vast difference between the culture of China in the mid-18th century and our modern world. Okay, so obviously a story set in Imperial China is going to seem really foreign to a modern audience. However, the issue here is not just the fact that things like funeral rites were different. The problem is that the author assumes that you already know what funeral rites and other events were like at that time, since he subverts them in a very subtle way. Dream of the Red Chamber is famous for being encyclopedic. However, there are also all sorts of subtle and hidden clues in the book that hint at what the author is really getting at. And so it becomes difficult to explain something like the obvious ostentatiousness of a massive funeral for a relatively minor character to an audience that might not know that the funeral is ostentatious. The death of Qing in chapter 13 is a really good example of this. So on the one hand, you can probably think of Qing as a minor character, and yet, on the other hand, she's treated kind of like a major character, and her death is what ignites the downfall of the Jia family. Her father-in-law throws a ton of time and money at her funeral in a way that makes it clear that the relationship between them is somewhat unusual. And of course, it turns out that he was likely taking advantage of her, though this is more alluded to than directly stated. The clue here is in the massive funeral he throws for her, which seems to be more fitting of a major political figure than somebody's daughter-in-law. Anyway, it's kind of hard to understand all of this without that cultural context. Again, the only way to really make this clear is to add in all sorts of commentary and careful explanations. If you're doing just like a run-of-the-mill translation, you're not going to be able to show clearly just how over-the-top all of this is, since Cao Shuiqing, the author, doesn't really do that in the original text. Anyway, the next point here has a lot to do with the characters, again, who are really the lifeblood of this novel. Dream of the Red Chamber is infamous for having a cast of several hundred characters, each with unique personalities, desires, and flaws. It's bad enough that you've got the 12 beauties of Jinling, or the 12 major female characters that play an extremely prominent role in the story. You've also got to worry about hundreds of minor characters, and it can be really difficult to tell these characters apart at times. So fortunately, you don't meet all of the characters at once. Actually, you meet them kind of one by one, and they all serve a very, very specific role when they relate to the main characters or the main story of the book. Actually, when you get down to it, Cao Shuiqing's method of introducing characters is really like nothing I've ever seen before. And it's also a really, really good example of what not to do if you're writing your own fiction, and yet he's able to get away with it. The thing is that characters in this book generally appear before they're introduced, as if the reader was supposed to somehow know that they were there all along. And so, at the beginning of chapter 14, a servant named Lai Sheng appears after having been briefly mentioned 5 chapters earlier. The wife of a servant named Lai Wang appears for the first time and performs a really important action, even though the reader has absolutely no idea who this is and might not figure it out for a while. And then we see another servant named Tai Ming, who we have never been introduced to before, but who was apparently there all along. Now, the fascinating thing here is that these characters are described in detail and they're given their own personalities, even though they're really just tools to push the story along. So, in other words, while these characters serve the same role that your stereotypical minor characters will serve in like normal books, the difference here is that they're really not stereotypes. It feels like they're actual people. Of course, it's not like you need to memorize the names of all the minor characters for the book to make sense. But at the same time, you can't just ignore the names of the characters or brush this stuff off. And you do have to be at least somewhat careful when you translate the names. David Hawkes, for example, calls one of the secondary male characters Bridie, even though it's clearly a man. Another secondary male character is named Sunshine, which is also really odd. So this is why in my translation I've chosen to simply use pinyin to transcribe the character names. Of course, there are problems when you come across names that clearly mean something, or when you have 2 characters who have names that are pronounced exactly the same. Both of those happen like all the time. In the end, the best way to clear all of this up, in my opinion, is to write lots and lots of translation notes and make it very clear who you're talking about. Now, the next point is going to be obvious to anybody who has ever tried to read this beast of a novel. Dream of the Red Chamber is filled with absolutely spectacular poetry. Some of the poems are designed to be profound and subtle. Some are designed to be comical or even ridiculous. And some seem to be at least somewhat sarcastic. Now, the biggest problem with these poems is that you will never be able to preserve the poetic structure. In my opinion, the best thing you can do is translate the poems to the best of your ability and then come up with a really good explanation afterwards. In The Story of the Stone, David Hawkes goes to great lengths to give his poetic translations both the Western-style rhyme and rhythm. The problem, of course, is that he has to sacrifice a lot of poetic meaning to get the rhyme and the rhythm just right. And then there's the issue of having no footnotes to explain things that are really obscure, such as how the Xiang flows and the Chu clouds sail away in this poem. Now, you guys know by now that I'm really not one to hide my opinions away. And frankly, I think that making these poems into cute, like, rhyming things is really stupid. In this book, the substance of the poetry is the most important part, not the form behind the poetry. And you can't translate Chinese poetic form into English anyway, so why even try to do these stupid cute things? So the thing is that classical Chinese poems would have tonal rhymes, demonstrated here by this pattern of ping and zi tonal classifications. The 2 general categories corresponded to the old 4 tones of Middle Chinese, which are different from the 4 or 5 tones of modern Chinese. So people like this random Reddit commentator are actually incorrect. Poetic rhyme in Chinese was actually nothing like what we would consider to be rhyme in modern Western language. And then you've got the problem of reconstructing older Chinese pronunciation. This is something you can do with the aid of various rhyming dictionaries and other bits of research we've done, but now you're really overemphasizing form over the substance of the poems. Anyway, the biggest problem with that insistence on forcing rhymes into poetic translation is that you will inevitably wind up losing a lot of the sense of the original, which means that people reading it are not going to know what's going on. So I ran into something similar a few years ago. I was reading Faust in the original German. This was not really a project, it was just something I wanted to do for myself. I had a couple of English translations. I found one that tried to keep the rhyming intact. So if you've never read Faust, like the whole thing rhymes in a variety of different poetic forms and has different sort of rhythms to each line and stuff. It's absolutely fabulous. The problem, though, is that this translation I found that tried to keep some of the rhyming intact inevitably would go like way off script, or it would give me like sentences and phrases that just didn't make sense. You see, the thing is that it's always better to focus on the substance first and then use notes to explain. For example, take that mysterious poem that I showed you earlier with the references to the flowing xiang and the clouds of Chu. The translation is always going to be mysterious, provided that you stick to the original text and you don't start adding stuff in. Anyway, it turns out that the Xiang River is in Hunan province and was part of the ancient state of Chu, and so the flowing of the river and the passing of the clouds of Chu represent something good dying off in the end due to its sad fate. Well, it's not so hard once you spend a little bit of time digging in, and that's really the way that the whole novel is. But there is one concept in Dream of the Red Chamber that is really hidden and that can be very difficult for anybody to understand. And that problem is at the heart of the novel itself. The biggest problem with Dream of the Red Chamber is that it's not really a love story. You can still find people who call it China's Romeo and Juliet, like this random rewriting of the story that was published in January 2026. Anyway, I hate to be rude to this author. I've never read the book, but I would bet big money that that's just AI slop. So stay away from that stuff. Just stick with me and what I'm doing here. The thing about this book is that it's really more a work of dystopian fiction than an actual love story, even though it's clearly written in the style of a three-way romance. Or in other words, the dystopian part is the fact that this is about the internal battles that the characters are fighting against the society around them. It's about that, not necessarily about the love story. In fact, the author actually goes on a small tirade in the unusual first chapter of the novel against established and proper Chinese fiction. Here he condemns Chinese fiction as being too moralistic and completely detached from human emotions, or Qing. Among other virtues, the girls in this novel are described as being talented, somewhat silly, or full of emotions, also called Qing. At the beginning of the story, the famous stone goes down to earth, along with a few spirits filled with Qing. I call them love ghosts here in this translation, but honestly, Qing really should be emotion or passion or human feeling, not just love. So, especially when you read this in Chinese, the more that you realize that the character Qing is actually at the heart of the novel, the more that you're going to realize that it's like everywhere in the book. Everywhere you look, you're going to run into it over and over again. Unfortunately, the two major English translations of Dream of the Red Chamber will call it like lust or love or something similar to that. But it's not that, it goes deeper. It's actually emotion. It's like human feeling. When Jia Baoyu first meets Lin Dayu, the emotion and raw feeling deep within both of them causes a magnetism unlike anything else anywhere in fiction. In fact, Jia Baoyu's attraction to Lin Dayu causes him to reject the special jade pendant that defines his character. When Jia Baoyu throws that jade aside, he is symbolically declaring that he would rather embrace the Qing deep within him than stick to the lifestyle that his family demands of him. And it's this conflict, the conflict between his family duties and what he really wants deep in his heart, this is the conflict that is at the heart of the novel. And it is really, really hard to bring that out in the translation. In fact, the truth is that it's not even that easy to see it in the original either. But once you know about it, once you know that it's there, you see it everywhere and you can't unsee it. Anyway, all of that gives you sort of an idea of the difficulties that are present here in translation, right? You got the character names, plus of course the fact that there are hundreds of them, the cultural differences, and then the big ones, right? The poetry, and then this concept of Qing. But the thing is that there are ways to go through it and there are ways around it. Anyway, if you got some time, come on over to my translation project, give it a try, take a look. As of the filming of this, I'm in chapter 14. Depending on when you see this, I might be a little bit further than that. But I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by how things look. Talk to you later.